Well, thank you for inviting me here today. Um, I have been a farmer here well, I've been on a farm all my life, and I've actually become kind of an activist farmer the last few years, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. Um, and it's been quite a trip here for the last few years, fighting for water and fighting for farms and our farm workers here in the valley. But just to tell you a little bit about myself, I grew up in Firebaugh on a farm. We moved there as a boy after my parents had been migrant workers for several decades. And so I grew up there, and I got to see the valley change from the 50s to the present, from an area that was really sheep grazing land that was changed by water. Um, and unless you knew what the valley was back then, you have a hard time appreciating it, because we have such a marvelous valley here today, which grows so many of our fruits, nuts, and vegetables that it's just I consider it a national treasure. But for many years there was no water here until the CBP came in the 60s. Up until that point, there were some people farming with wells, and there was just grazing and so forth. But the Central Valley Project came in the 60s. They built a system of dams for capturing water, canals for transferring it, pumps for moving it. And so back in the 60s, I got to see those facilities being built right through our valley. And when those projects were built back in the 60s until 1990, the farmers had plenty of water. They had 100% of their water every year, except for 1977, which was probably the worst drought in the last 75 years. So everything was pretty hunky-dory then, and farmers were growing a lot of cotton, melons, tomatoes, and so forth on the west side of the valley. And what I mean the west side, basically means from Tracy all the way down to Bakersfield. And there's two projects, the Central Valley Project that goes down to about Kettleman, and then it's the State Water Project that goes beyond that. In 1990, there was a law passed called the Central Valley Project Improvement Act that was authored by George Miller of Contra Costa and Bill Bradley from the East Coast. And basically what it did, it came in, and the thing that we farmers remember most about that act is that it took 800,000 acre feet away from the farmers on the west side every year. And so that set us back. So for the next almost 20 years, from 1990 till 2008, we had water restrictions quite often, anywhere from 25% supply to 100% supply. Our average allocation was about 65%. Farmers went through a lot of changes during that time. First of all, when they got the first restrictions, the first thing they did was, oh my God, we don't have water, we can't plant. And they didn't plant. They just left their land idle. That was a very serious thing. It was a serious loss for the farmers. It was a serious loss for their farm workers. And when we didn't have water and the farm workers didn't have work, it hurt not only the farmers and the farm workers, but also their communities. And so farmers had to adjust and adapt, and they did a couple of things to do that. First of all, they went and learned newer and higher tech irrigation systems. They became more efficient with their water. And then they started changing their cropping patterns. When you have a resource like water that's so precious and so scarce like it is on the west side, you need to learn to find what is the best thing you can do with that water. Okay, you can't grow grain with it and cotton with it anymore, because you can do things with it that are much better economically. And so farmers started transforming the west side into things like vegetables and fruits, into trees like almonds and pistachios and grapes. So there was quite a transition there, and farmers learned to adapt. And I have to say, farmers are very adaptable people. and they're very resilient people. Most of my friends that were farming there in 1990 are still there today. They're pretty gray like me today, but they're still going. They fought a lot of battles, and they continue to go. Then in 2008, another change came. There was a lawsuit that resulted in some biological opinions that were written by two of our fish agencies, the U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife and the NOAA Fisheries, on behalf of two of the fish species that were in trouble. And those were the smelt and the salmon, of course. Up until then, farmers had, they had adjusted to learning about water supply, and they would watch hydrology, how much it rained, how much it snowed, how much water we had in the reservoirs. And of course, they knew that they had to take that 800,000 acre feet aside. They weren't going to get that, and they were standing farther back in line to get their allocation of water. But this biological opinion brought in a whole new dynamic into this thing, because now it had nothing to do with how much water, how much rainfall there was, how much snow there was. Didn't matter how much water was in the reservoirs, because now the operations in the delta were going to be dictated by those fish agencies. Okay, and just so you understand how water gets to us, we capture water in the north in the reservoirs. It comes down through the rivers there near Sacramento. It has to come across the delta to the pumps near Tracy. Then it goes by canal to San Luis, and then from there on, that water provides some water to about 23 to 25 million people in the state from those two sets of pumps. It goes over to the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, all the west side of the valley, and down to Los Angeles and San Diego. That water reaches a lot of people, and so that's the way our system works. And people say our system's broken, our water system's broken. It isn't really broken. The pumps work, the canals flow, the dams are still there. What's broken is the delta and the delta ecosystem. And that's probably a subject for another time, because I could probably spend an hour on that alone. But that is one of the things that has created the situation that we're in. And it makes it, for farmers, quite a challenge to deal with uncertainties about how much water you're going to get. You make your plans in the fall for the next year. I'm going to plant this and this and this. You get all geared up for it. You prepare the ground. You invest in fertilizers, and then, in December you go to your banker, and he says, "Well, what do you have for water?" I don't know. I don't know what we're going to have to water till they decide to allocate it. That may be in March or April. By that time, we've got crops planted in the ground. So we're playing this game every year. It's a very tricky game. It's a very risky game. And so in 2009, though, because of some drought conditions and the biological opinions, we were only allocated 10% of our water. That means that in reality, you only had enough water for 10% of your acres. You'd have to leave 90% of your ground idle. Well, that was a very devastating thought to everybody. And so in 2009, the Latino Water Coalition got together and said, listen, the farmers I know we're all in deep trouble, but somebody has to speak for the farm workers. Nobody speaks for the farm workers. Farm workers are hardworking, they're dependable people. They do everything that's asked of them. They never speak up. Okay? So we had to stand up and speak for them. They needed somebody. So what we did is the Latino Water Coalition got together on the 14th, and on the 14th of April, we started a march from Mendota to the west side to the reservoir, San Luis. We were prepared for 600 or 800 people. We got 4,000 people the first day. People were coming from everywhere. I mean, we're expecting farmers and farm workers we got their whole families, you know.